Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal, episode 21. I'm the Eric, the IT guy Hendricks, and joining me is my illustrious co-host Scott McBrien.
Good morning.
All right, so we've had a lot of requests for this. We're going to dive in even deeper into SELinux. Today, we're going to be looking at networking and Booleans. All right, so if you recall, in a previous episode, we talked about using SELinux to manage files. Today, we're going to start out by looking at different ports. So we mentioned that that SELinux comes pre-built with definitions for some of the well-known ports like 22 and 80. But Scott, in today's example, what if we wanted to change our SSH port to say something like 2022?
Oh, well, let's do it. So if we go into the etc sshd sshd config file and we update our port here, when we restart the service, it will listen on port 2022 instead of port 22, which means that when we're using command line tools like SSH or SCP or SFTP, we'd have to provide a port option to direct it to the correct location instead of the default port 22. And we talked about this briefly in an earlier episode about SSH, but we didn't actually carry out our change. And that's important because earlier we weren't ready to have the SELinux conversation. But if I go ahead and restart the service right now, we will see that it fails. And if we do a status, it is currently failed, right? So it was running. I changed the port. I restarted it. It failed to run. Now, I happen to know that this is an SELinux problem. But if we're thinking it might be an SELinux problem, what we could do is a set enforce 0 to temporarily disable it. Right? Restart our service, and now everything's fine. But when we set enforce 1 and we restart our service, it fails again. So SELinux not there, everything's cool. SELinux in enforcing mode, things break again. That's your key to knowing that this is an SELinux related problem. So if we take a look at the var log messages, we can see some error messages about SELinux, right? And we get this one right here, I think, is the most appropriate. SELinux is preventing the SSH daemon from name-bind access to the TCP socket port 2022. Right? So remember that SELinux overall is a policy that will control interactions between applications and system resources. And in our earlier SELinux episode, we looked at applications and files. But now we're going to talk about interactions between SELinux and ports. So if we take a look at the semange command, port subcommand, and do a listing, these are all of the types and ports that SELinux allows to happen. So let me just pull out the SSH line here. And so what we're saying in this rule is that an application that's running that has SSH port type or SSH port T type access is allowed to access port 22. Notice that our port 2022, is not in that list. So when we are trying to bind to port 2022 is not an SSH port T type, and the kernel refuses access to that service trying to attach to that new port number. So to fix it, we need to add port 2022 to this SSH port list. So again, we're going to use semange. We're going to add the type SSH port T for TCP port 2022 connections. All right, and now when we do that same query of listing all the ports and then just grabbing out the SSH port, all right, notice the port 2022 is listed as now an allowed port number to go to SSH port T connections. All right, so now that it's been added and permitted to attach to that port number, if I do a systemctl start SSHD, no problems. And if I do a status, right there we go. So remember that earlier when we were talking about SSH or about SELinux, I said put files in places where one would expect them. Like when you put web content, put in var www, because that's where Red Hat expects it and where we've authored the policy to expect it. Same thing is true for ports. If you attach services to ports that we expect, you shouldn't see a problem, right? Port 80, port 443, that stuff all works with web servers. But when you start to get into more eclectic port mappings, you may encounter one of these conflicts. But now you know how to diagnose and resolve that conflict.
That was beautiful. It almost brought me to tears. So, if we wanted to do some other additional troubleshooting or configuration changes with ports in SELinux, is there any way I can check on the system for how to do that?
Good question. So the SELinux management that we're doing was through a command called semange. If we look at the man page for it, down at the very bottom in the C also is semange-port. So semange has several additional commands that are part of it, like we saw in an earlier one, fcontext. Now we saw port, right? And you'll see that each one of those subsets of commands has its own man page. So if we take a look at the man page for semange-port, and we take a look for examples, here's an example of allowing a service to listen on a non-default port for that service. So two examples. One is allowing Apache to listen on port 81, which is a port it doesn't normally listen on. And then there's another example that's for SSH port 8991. We used port 2022 as an example. But so here are two examples of how you could actually do this. In the example section, you just need to update the type and the port number to be correct for your implementation or your configuration.
I love it when a man page has examples. Makes life easy.
Yeah, and we talked about in-page or in-system help and man pages pretty substantially in episode 15.
We did. I'll make sure to link that in the show notes. So next up, we also wanted to cover Booleans. So Booleans are ways of it's easier to use than to explain. Booleans are a way to set up operators. Basically, wow, I just blanked. Sorry. Morning, Eighth Doctor. Scott, you want to bail me out?
Sure. So realize that SELinux policy is a set of rules. And so when you're crafting that set of rules, you can choose to craft specific rules that tie to a setting. And in SELinux, the setting that we most often use is called a Boolean. So if we do a get SEBool -a to list all the Booleans available in our currently running policy, right? What we see is the Boolean name and then whether it's on or off. All right, so I'm going to scroll up a bit to the web server related ones. All right, so there's a whole bunch of policy rules that look at these Booleans to decide how to customize Apache's interactions with services or ports or files based off of the status of these settings. And it looks like we may have lost my screen share.
Yeah, I just noticed that. Let me.
Oh, there it is back. Okay, so for example, we have this HTTP can connect FTP, right? So can we accept FTP-based connections? Oh, here's one that says, can we do LDAP-based connections, right? That's probably a user authentication-related one. HTTP can connect Zabbix, right? So Zabbix is a open source monitoring solution. And so based off of these Booleans being on or off, we'll customize segments of the policy to permit Apache to do things or refuse Apache to do things. And so by default, a lot of the stuff is off. But let's take a look at one specifically. This one right here. HTTPD enable holders. So way back in like the beginning of web times, you had one server and you hosted all kinds of stuff on that one server because servers were really expensive. And so one of the things that was really common was to have a web server that hosted a variety of websites, and each website had to be controlled by different people. And this is probably still the case in some places like web hosting today. So one of the ways that you could architect that multi-site arrangement is to give each person their own user account, and then their web content would live in their home directory. That way you could isolate them into just their home directory area, and they could put whatever content they wanted there, but they wouldn't be able to see other people's sites or manage other people's sites in other people's home directories. So here in the SELinux policy, we have a HTTPD enable holders off. Right? And without going into a lot of detail, essentially, right now in the default policy, if Apache tries to access files that are of type user holder type, it's refused, right? Because we're looking to access only Apache related content, things like in var www. So by default, if Apache tried to go into somebody's home directory and share files out of there, it would fail. But with this Boolean, you can add that capability back in without making significant changes to the policy, right? The rules already exist in the policy to permit it, and we control whether that segment of the policy is enabled or disabled with this Boolean. So I can do a set se bool. Oops, let's try that. HTTPD enable holders helps you spell it right. And now if we look at that list again, I'm just going to pull out the one for the one we're interested in. Right? I've toggled that from off, meaning web servers are not allowed to access people's home directories, to on, meaning now web servers are able to access people's home directories. This change happened in memory, though. So right now it's not a persistent change. So if we wanted to make this a persistent change, not just for the one time of our current instance of the machine, we'd have to add an option to permanently set this Boolean value. And what it does is it goes and persists this change in the policy metadata so that when we agree with the machine, this change will be remade to the settings of the Booleans. So now it'll persist across reads. So there's lots and lots of different services that can be controlled by SELinux, and then the author of the policy for those services can create Booleans and decide to trigger certain segments of the policy rules or not based on the value of that Boolean. And so another example, there's something in there about access to NFS files.
Mm-hmm.
So should Apache be able to access files that are mounted to your machine through NFS? There's another one that does that too. I think it's like enable NFS holders or something along those lines. So, there's a bunch of different small changes that you can make to enable SELinux to do something. If it's interfering with something that you think you should be able to do, that's another place to check and take a look at.
Let's see. I think we covered Eighth Doctor's question about setting 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 Booleans with SE bool. Do we want to do another example, Scott?
Let's see. Let's take a look at all of the Booleans again. So I'm looking through the list, looking for ones that I happen to know what they do. One of the things we haven't gotten into yet is like, what are the rules in the policy, and how can I inspect the actual rules? I think that's probably a later episode. So there are some here with Samba, right? And so some of these are Samba create homeDIRs. That's if somebody is using your Samba server to authenticate, should we automatically create a home directory for them as well? There's one for enabling homeDIRs to allow that to happen too. Samba export, right? So are we offering things to people using Samba? And then there's one Samba run unconfined, which means that Samba should just be excluded from all the policy. All right. There's a few for rsync. All right, so the ones probably of specific note are things like rsync anon write, right? So can anonymous authenticated users to rsync be able to write files into your directory tree? There's a couple Postgres ones. Here's some NFS ones. So notice that a couple of these are turned on by default. So we rely on the NFS configuration of the machine to decide how to offer things. So if the NFS configuration says something is offered read-only, we should offer it read-only. If it says that it's offered read-write, it should be offered read-write. Eric, I don't know if I should try resharing my screen because I see it keep dropping off and on again.
Yeah, it might turn it off and on again.
Yeah.
Except it's back now.
Yeah, but that's okay. All right. So the other kind of one that's here that's disabled is NFSD anon write. So if you have NFS shares that are offered to the NFS nobody user, right? That person doesn't have a user ID on the system, or they might have been squashed, like using the root squash feature. Should they be able to upload files to your system? Man, I don't know what's going on with this today.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, and then there's a whole pile of ones with HTTPD that you can make changes to how it's operating your web server settings. And here's the HTTPD use NFS one that I was talking about, right? Should Apache be able to utilize documents or content that's shared with it via NFS? So anyway,
and the good news, the good news for systems administrators is that with a lot of these booleans, it's included as part of the RPM install. So if you install HTTPD, a lot of these booleans will be set as part of the installation process, so you don't have to go in and manually make those changes after the fact. But I think I stepped over something you were saying, Scott.
Well, I saw that there was a question from Eighth Doctor about is there documentation of these things with descriptions and stuff? Varying levels of yes. So I think that we do pretty good at things like ports and SE managed stuff. That's pretty well documented. The Booleans are less so from what I've experienced. Really, what you need to do is look at the rules in the SELinux policy, pulling out those that reference the Boolean value, because, like, for example, HTTPD can check spam. That will actually be at a component in the rule. So if you grepped for that specific string, you would be able to pull out all the rules that were affected by the Boolean that you are interested in. So there's not documentation of like, oh, look at this Red Hat document and it tells you about all the Booleans that exist. It's more, if you're down to the Boolean level, you probably need to be more intimately aware of what the policy is doing, which means you need to query the policy, look at the rules, and figure it out. So, so self-documenting code, maybe? I don't know.
That's a good question. Can you please take an SELinux example for C groups and namespaces?
So I don't think there's SE. So I think what you're getting at is the fact that SELinux is used by containerized environments to help separate the container processes from the rest of the system. So the thing to note there is that containers are often run with a type called container T. And so processes that are running with container T type are containerized processes. SELinux enforces the namespaces, but doesn't necessarily create or manage the namespaces. There's actually additional configuration files for that. Same thing with C groups. So C groups is built into the into systemd to do resource allocation and resource limitation. SELinux is a component of enforcement for those things, but SELinux itself doesn't define C groups. C groups is a separate technology. And with Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9 currently in beta, C group 2 is going to be the method through which we do C groups going forward. So not a great answer to your question. I'm sorry, but that's what I got off the cuff.
All right, well, we'll give a moment for any last minute questions, but that's a high level view of networking and Booleans. Yeah, I'm excited about C Group too. That'll make processes and containerization much easier to work with. Let's see. So I've missed you all. I've been doing the summit things and the RHEL 9 things the last couple of weeks. So thank you, Scott, for holding down the fort while I've been away. Next week on episode 22, we're actually going to have our first guest on Into the Terminal. We're going to bring on Rich Dorito. He's a Red Hatter who works a lot with our subscription management process for not only for RHEL but some of our other tools as well. So looking forward to bringing on our first guest onto the show. We'll talk about subscriptions to a little bit deeper level. Meanwhile, be sure to like this episode, share it out with a friend, because we all know that if you disable SELinux, that makes Dan Walsh cry, and no one wants to see that. And then we can all join Scott tonight for Into the Terminal Dark Mode. At 9 p.m. Eastern, we'll be talking about we'll take another look at networking and Booleans. Scott, any closing thoughts before we wrap for the day?
No, just to double up on the like if you like the content, because we get judged by that kind of metric, and then also see you all maybe tonight in dark mode.
All right. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.